I want to take you to an article that I think is actually terrifying and, speaks to the sort of dystopian kind of a world that we're living in. I'll just say, I'm a bereaved relative. My mother died in June of 2021. Within 3 months of having the vaccine, I'm going to tell you how I feel about it. I want the truth. I know friends of mine who were doctors were thinking about leaving the state because they couldn't post on social media. They were, could lose their license. Oh my God, this is the biggest topic of all time. Hello and welcome back to the Evolution of Medicine podcast. This is season 2, episode 7, and really excited to be back with you again. We got so many interesting comments and feedback from last week's episode. It was a totally different type of a show because we were doing it around that one faux infomercial, and apparently a lot of you have seen it and many of you felt similarly to I, of just the sort of contrasting emotions of that show. So if you haven't gone and watched that, go back and check it out. You'll see AI versions of Sanjay Gupta and Anderson Cooper telling you about reversing cognitive decline. It's very interesting and is a good insight into where we're going next as a society with AI and video and all these kind of things. But I am not AI. I am here with you. I am in Northern California. My name's James Maskell and I'm your host. And today we are going to do, as ever, we're going to look at news and we're going to look at Clinical Corner, and then we are going to look at some innovations as well along the way. So let's jump right into it. I want to take you to an article that I think is actually terrifying and, speaks to the sort of dystopian kind of a world that we're living in. And I saw this, it was shared on social media, and I just wanted to check on it. So this is from the Daily Telegraph. This is talking about the COVID vaccines and their effect in the UK. And this is something that obviously still looms pretty large in our world. And you will see through this why this still looms large in our world. There is still a great deal of division as to were the COVID vaccines a net benefit for anyone? Right? Were they beneficial for older people and did they keep them out of hospitals? Were they beneficial for younger people? And what does the rest of the bell curve look like? I want to bring this topic up because this is, happening recently. And also there's just some elements in here that I think we need to look at because this is still affecting the healthcare that's happening, 5 years after COVID and 4 years after the rollout. It was actually this time 5 years ago when they announced that the COVID vaccine was coming out. And you may have seen that sign which showed, the contrasting fortunes of, let's say, Zoom and Delta Airlines on that day, because it was great news, big news, November 2020, that there was going to be a vaccine on its way and that it was safe and effective. So here we are, 5 years later. This is the Telegraph 2025. The title is Government Withholding Data That May Link COVID Jabs to Excess Deaths. UK HSA argued that releasing figures would lead to distress or anger of bereaved relatives if connection were discovered. I'll just say, I'm a bereaved relative. My mother died in June of 2021. Within 3 months of having the vaccine, I don't think it was the only cause. There was a lot of other stuff going on. She was 85 years old. She was by herself, isolated into a nursing home for the whole of 2020. So bereaved relative right here. I'm going to tell you how I feel about it. Public health watchdog has been accused of a cover-up after refusing to publish data that could link the COVID vaccine to excess deaths. The UK Health Security Agency, UK HSA, argued that releasing the data would lead to distress or anger bereaved relatives if the link were to be discovered. Public health officials also argued that publishing the data risked damaging the well-being and mental health of the families and friends of people who died. I mean, I'll just tell you for a fact, I want the truth. I think that the mental health of everyone being lied to, for 5 years is one of the reasons why we have an absolute crisis. So I just want the truth. I'd like to know if that was a trend across society, and, my mental health will only get better from knowing whether that was true or not. So in a letter to UK HSA, the Department of Health and MPs and peers said that potentially critical data, which mapped the date of people's COVID vaccine to the date of their deaths, had been released to pharmaceutical companies, but not put into the public domain. That kind of tells you everything about where the priorities of the public, where people who work for the government are. If they give it to the pharmaceutical companies who created the assets, who created the vaccines, that seems like a massive signal that they are not working in the interest of the public. They argue that data should be released on the same anonymized basis that was shared with pharmaceutical groups, and there seems to be no credible reason why that should not be done immediately. Agreed. Us for Them, a campaign group, requested that UK HSA release the data under freedom of information laws, but the agency refused, making a number of different arguments, including that publish the data could lead to misinformation and that would have an adverse impact on vaccine uptake. Now, I want to talk about the word misinformation for a moment because, the COVID pandemic gave us a lot of new concepts that had to be put out there in order to help people understand the world. And what is misinformation? So misinformation is false and inaccurate information that is spread by mistake. There's no intent to cause harm. The person that believes it to be true, it's false, and accidentally sharing an incorrect date for a local event. That would be an example of misinformation. So I'm reading here. But they invented a new thing in the pandemic called malinformation, which is genuine factual information that is shared with the intent to cause harm, often by taking it out of context or moving private information into the public sphere. I think they're saying it's more likely that it would cause malinformation, not misinformation, because ultimately, if I find out that the majority, that there was a significant increase in excess deaths, and that those were happening in line with the rollout of the jabs, I would want to know that. One of the big things that happened in America was the way that they counted it, where they said you were technically unvaccinated until day 14, and day 14 after you received the vaccine. And why is that a big problem? Because if you look at the historical VAERS database, you see that the vast majority of people who have reactions to vaccines is in day 0, 1, 2, or 3. So all those people would have been counted in the unvaccinated. So this is the information that we've kind of been waiting for, and it's kind of a big deal because I think a lot of people lost a lot of trust and are never going to get it back unless this is answered. Because if you've been paying attention to excess deaths, you know that something is causing a lot more deaths than are normal at this moment. So there are excess deaths. UK HSA also claimed there'll be a risk of individuals being identified despite the request being made for anonymized data set. And after a 2-year battle, the Information Commissioner ruled in the UK HSA's favour, backing its refusal to publish the data. Reform UK is committed to a public inquiry into excess deaths and COVID vaccine harms. Richard Tice, party's deputy leader, said, "We know there was concern about excess deaths, which is why we called for an inquiry. Instead, unelected Quango, UK HSA, is involved in a scandalous cover-up of how and why people are dying. This is totally unacceptable, and the health secretary must overrule them. If we are not prepared to learn the lessons about why people are dying, what sort of society are we?" And I think this is a good place to end it. And it is wondering, what kind of society are we? One of the things that I've seen, I listen to other podcasts. I listen to like the Dark Horse podcast. Brett and Heather talk pretty consistently about the fact that we haven't really learned any lessons from the pandemic. And it was such a big deal. We should have learned a lot of lessons from the pandemic. And yet here we are still wondering whether the public can handle the truth. You can handle the truth. Well, I think we probably can handle the truth, because ultimately we want to make good decisions for ourselves and our family. And as long as we're not able to access the truth, that is going to be very hard to do. There's other stuff in this article that is relevant. They talk about an infected blood scandal, which, was a previous example of where this kind of thing came up again. And the UK HSA spokesman said, "Protecting patient confidentiality is of critical importance. Releasing this data presents a real possibility of being used to identify individuals, which could result in significant distress." Not more distress than them dying 2 days after the COVID vaccine, right? That's much more distressing. And so we need to contextualize the distress here. And, I'm pretty concerned about this, but I think that hopefully we should get some of this information, or this information will continue to coming out because there's freedom of information requests. We've also seen, lots of organizations trying to get their hands on this information, because if you look out at the world, there are significant numbers of excess deaths that are unaccounted for and correlate with the rollout of the mRNA jabs. And so ultimately, truth and reconciliation is the key thing here. I grew up in South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and the process that was gone through in order to create some sort of harmony, to allow some sort of rainbow nation to emerge under the Mandela government, was truth and reconciliation. You cannot have reconciliation without truth. We need to understand what the net was on this rollout and what worked. Ultimately, you still see headlines flying around I saw one the other day saying that, that having the vaccine improved your chances if you were having cancer. And then I've seen sort of that debunked. And there's just like, we're living in this post-truth environment where ultimately it's hard to know exactly what's going on. And there are layers and layers of people whose job it is to keep this sort of information from the public. So this is a problem. Now, I want to be in solution oriented because I want to get actually back to now our clinical corner and get back to something that is super frustrating about the last decade or the last 5 years that we've been living in. I think that there was so much potential for the functional medicine movement, the lifestyle medicine movement, and big organizations to use the pandemic as an opportunity to solve the exact problems that are facing all of us right now. Chronic disease is the big problem. We are focused fully on chronic disease now. You see, what's happening in America. We're trying to get focused towards chronic illness. And ultimately, it is the scourge. It's why I got involved in medicine 20 years ago, because I saw that this was coming, and here it is now. And, it is bankrupting all of us. Look at right now, you're seeing the panic in America as they take away the Obamacare subsidies and everyone realizes, oh my God, healthcare is so expensive. But that was what I was arguing 7 years ago, is that the reason why healthcare is so expensive, one, the prices are out of control, ridiculous corruption. You need to build everything on top of stable, low prices. But the second thing is everyone's chronically ill. And if you have a situation where everyone's chronically ill, obviously it's going to cost a lot because the cost of chronic illness is ridiculously high. That's what I learned in my health economics more than 20 years ago, and it couldn't be more true. And I couldn't have been more right about the situation that we find ourselves in. So obviously there was an opportunity at the very beginning of the COVID to use platforms to talk about creating health. And there was also a great opportunity for the functional medicine community to lead the charge on understanding what immunity actually is. That would have been great. And it actually did happen. In today's Clinical Corner, we are going to go back to what I think was probably the best presentation that happened. And just to give you some context, I'll show you the slide here. But ultimately, this presentation that I'm going to show you today, or some of the slides from this presentation, was given on April 16th, 2020. You can see it right here. I was one of the speakers. Jeff Bland was the first speaker. Dr. Ari Vojdani was the second speaker. And this is his presentation. Cheng Ron was the third speaker, and I was the fourth speaker. And we had about 5,000 doctors that were registered. No one knew what was going on. But what you will see in this presentation, a lot was known. We knew a lot, and we still haven't learned these lessons. So let's go. What is the first slide? So the name of Ari's presentation, and Ari Vojdani is a legend. He was on the first Evolution of Medicine Summit. He's the godfather of functional autoimmunity, really understanding the autoimmune mechanisms and the way to bring it back. He was very involved in the beginning of the Cyrex labs. And so, here we go. The crisis of the immune system, how COVID-19 impacts chronic immune conditions and its implication on building immune resilience in your patients. We should have been talking about immune resilience. We were. I launched a product in June of 2020 called the Immune Collaborative, groups of people working together online to build their immune resilience. I watched this, I took action. It turned into the Business Heal community, but it was so obvious to me what needed to happen. So here's the question. Why do COVID-19 infection and mortality rates differ from state to state and from country to country? This is the key graph. I shared this on social media and everyone wanted to know, because this is the valuable information that people wanted to know about. Why do so many people get exposed to SARS-CoV-2 and some people don't get infected, some get a mild infection, and some get a serious infection. So I'm just going to talk you through this if you're listening to this at home. But ultimately what you see is the three categories there: no infection, mild infection, serious infection. And ultimately, what Dr. Vojdani, what this shows is that your reaction is going to be a function of your 6 viral barriers. So the viral droplets come into the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And these 6 viral barriers are going to be the determinant as to whether you get no infection, mild infection, or serious infection. So what is the first one? The exposome. What does that mean? The history of all of your exposures forever. right? So that's a big deal. That's an important information. Like, how compromised is your detoxification system? How many toxins have you taken in? This is a key issue, and probably one of the reasons why American did so badly when it comes to COVID is because we got way more toxins in the environment. This was called out April 2020 by Dr. Ari Vajdani. Second, mucosal immunity. Oh my God. This is the biggest topic of all time. Literally, when they're rolling out the vaccines and saying it's like so effective, I'm texting with my functional medicine friends, say, can you believe this? Like, why is no one talking about mucosal immunity? This is actually something that the functional medicine community should have led on in their communities, because people in functional medicine know that part of immunity is mucosal immunity, and and part of it is other. We're going to get into that a little bit later. You got mucosal immunity and you got systemic immunity. We've done so much on this since then, but ultimately the vaccines didn't really affect mucosal immunity in the same way. Neutralizing antibodies. Do you have a lot of neutralizing antibodies? How are the state of your viral receptors? The innate immune response, how good is that? And the anti-inflammatory cytokines. So this was predicting who would get a bad result. And essentially what you see is that if you're young and healthy, you're going to get almost no infection. And if you're old and unhealthy, you're going to get a serious infection. And so why did America do worse than any other country? It's not because we've got an older population, because there are countries with older populations. It's because we're all chronically ill. It's because we're all chronically ill. That is the reason why we struggled and we had the most deaths. Never mind the putting everyone onto breathing apparatus and other things that cause that. Never mind sending people into nursing homes, but that is the number one thing. So here the sign talks about the external environment, the internal environment that affects us, the exposome and health. Now we're getting into the science that Ari showed there, personal experiences in the world of exposome. He talked about himself there, the classification of the immune system. Right? We have mucosal immunity and systemic immunity. Antibodies are involved in both, but ultimately SIgA, SIgM, mucosal immunity, and that's detected in the saliva. And then you have IgG, IgA, IgM, and IgE detected in the blood serum. And ultimately, this is an area where we could have been a lot more forthright in really understanding that this, both of these need to be in play for us to really understand immune health. So IgA immunity, this immune system's defensive wall through the digestive tract, individuals with normal secretory IgA, you can see that here. Do salivary antibodies reliably reflect both mucosal and systemic immunity? Two major antibody classes operate in saliva, secretory IgA and IgG. And it says at the end, saliva remains an interesting biological fluid with great scientific and clinical potentials. And so probably would have been interesting to understand some of that information. And so that's what's being talked about there. He talked about food allergy intolerance, talked about the epithelial cells, the gut lining, talked about infection, replication, and spread. This is really interesting. So how do viruses spread? The viral DNA, the replication process, and the spread. Not much talked about this out there in the world, but ultimately, this is that. So we should probably be able to make, this available, because ultimately, there's information here about the B cells, the T cells, and the differentiation of the T cells. We had spoken a couple of weeks ago about the Treg cells and, the recent Nobel Prize for that, and what it would look like to have a balanced immune system. But what it like in this time, I know everyone was scared. I know everyone was scared of losing their license. I know that people who got in front of their community and got vitamin D and other antiviral herbal tools out into their community got cease and desist letters, anyone who was doing it at reasonable scale. So I understand. And then in California, where I was, I know friends of mine who were doctors were thinking about leaving the state because they couldn't post on social media. They were, could lose their license. But, we missed a big opportunity to lead here, because ultimately, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, and Dr. Chris Turnpaugh, who runs Turnpaugh Health and Wellness, one of the biggest and most successful functional medicine clinics in the country, gave a talk on immunity. And I was speaking to a doctor afterwards. It was an hour and a half talk, and he was like, I did immunity in undergrad and in medical school, and the primer that you just gave me in an hour and a half was more valuable than all of that. So in our community, we have so much knowledge and understanding of how the immune system actually works, and yet we're just not talking about it in the way that it needs to be talked about, and we have all of that information in our community. So hopefully we're all in a position where you who's listening to this can go out and be an educator in your community, to go out and talk about how people can avoid the next pandemic by getting healthy, to talk about how people can avoid the rising healthcare costs by being healthy. This is what is necessary in our time today. And ultimately, this is it. I want to show you one last slide, which is essentially talking about, the 6-ohm concept of viral infection. And I think this just sort of lays it all out. What are the different ohms that contribute towards viral infection or not? There's the genome, right? There's going to be some level of genetic susceptibility. There's the exposome we've talked about before. There's the gut microbiome. There's the foodome. And all of those things together create the immunome. And basically your immunome and the relationship with the virome is going to determine whether or not you get effective. And this is something, all of the stuff here on the left is ultimately under the control of you and your patients as you support them in building immune resilience. And ultimately, this is going to help your brain health. It's super interdependent. So this is going to help your brain health. This is going to help your cardiovascular health. This is going to help your metabolic health. We've talked about the immunometabolic connection. So there's a lot there. And then how to build your immune resilience. This slide was great. How to build your mucosal immune system, moderate exercise, stress reduction, colostrum, chicken, mushroom extracts, glutamine, glutathione, probiotics, fiber, flavonoids, echinacea, alicillin from garlic. And then it has there how to build your phagocytosis, T and B cell function, NK cell activity, regulatory T cell and cytokines. You can see all of that information there. We'll put this in the show notes so that you can get this. But man, I wish this had been able to be broadcast to 1 billion people in the same way that we vaccinated 7 billion people. This information could have affected and could now still affect the next, 7 generations beyond us as we really understand what it takes to build immune resilience so that we're not so fearful and so dysfunctional when the next thing comes along. So this is Clinical Corner. Thank you, Dr. Ari Vojdani, for leading the way. Thank you, Dr. Elroy Vojdani, for taking it up to the next level. Elroy is an amazing educator. If you've never seen him talk, definitely cut from the same cloth. So much information on, what we could be doing here. And if you're listening again, make sure to take a look at these slides because there's a ton of value here. And we'll have the key ones on goevomed.com/podcast where we have this. All right, so that is the clinical side. All right, so to put this into context of why this is important now is that there's still commercials going on for the COVID-19 vaccine. And look, when the vaccine first came out, it was clear in the press or otherwise that you were an anti-vaxxer if you weren't up to date with the recommended initial vaccines and then boosters. Unfortunately, that means that more than 90% of America is an anti-vaxxer now by that same classification because so few people are up to speed or up to having the latest dose of the booster. I don't know anyone who's had a COVID vaccine in the last 3 years. I know they do exist. I just don't know any of them. Or maybe I don't know that they know, but this commercial that's on now for Next Spike is still live. This is why it's important for us to be clear about what happened. If we know that COVID jabs cause excess deaths, we should know that now because this is still on TV in America today. Let's take a look.
Meet this year's senior class, back together and most likely to get protected with mNEXSpike, a new and different COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna for adults 65 and older. These seniors chose mNEXSpike because it targets the virus differently to provide a robust immune response at a lower dose. mNEXSpike is a COVID-19 vaccine for people 65 and older. You shouldn't get mNEXSpike if you've had an allergic reaction to a previous Moderna COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't. Moderna has never had a successful product. Its first product was the COVID vaccine. Look at the share price of Moderna. It's a disaster. And it's because they don't have, like Merck or Pfizer, a massive back catalog of other products that are also profitable. So they need this thing to work.
Rare cases of inflammation of the heart muscle and outer lining have been reported.
Wasn't that rare? I watched a lot of soccer. You see all the people going down, young people, athletes. I know this is for older people, but I also know that a lot of other older people have struggled with this and heart, myocarditis.
The most common side effects are injection site pain, tiredness, headache, muscle and joint pain, chills, nausea or vomiting, swelling or soreness under the arm. These seniors are celebrating homecoming with a lower dose COVID-19 vaccine that helps them enjoy their time together, like it's senior year all over again.
Why do they need a lower dose? Surely they should have the full dose. Maybe the lower dose should be for the kids that were under 100 pounds.
Spike, the new COVID-19 vaccine by Moderna for the senior class. Ask your pharmacist or doctor about Spike.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, again, it comes back to the point. That might be extremely valuable and it might be extremely harmful. The only way that we're going to know is to have truth and reconciliation about what happened the first time around. And ultimately, I think that there's no reason, why this information is being kept under wraps or why it's not coming out, because there is a large percentage of the population now that obviously doesn't trust to take the latest booster and ultimately, are not going to trust this. And ultimately, if you want truth before reconciliation, that's all we're asking for here. All right, let's talk a little bit about our partners here. We're going to talk about some of the resources that we have available on our Innovation Corner and talk about big problem that is facing practitioners that I've heard people talk about in all different areas. But I do want to talk a little bit about, some of our partners. So I've mentioned True Neuro is going gangbusters. I think a lot of practitioners have been waiting for something to make it easier to do this multimodal approach to reversing cognitive decline. And so we're seeing lots of clinics signing up, getting involved with the mentorship, support, and the technology to synthesize and organize that data. Go to goevomed.com/TrueNeuro and you can get set up on that. And, I was just at Freedom Practice Coaching's conference this last weekend. They're another one of our, mission partners. And, there are now, I think, a dozen doctors who signed up for both True Neuro and FPC because they were doing their regular functional medicine practice or psychiatry practice, and they wanted to add brain health. And they realized that adding a new program into the practice was going to take some support. And ultimately, they are all thriving. Like I saw all of them this weekend. Someone is adding another practitioner, another doctor to their practice. Another one is starting to roll this out to a lot more patients. We have really exciting things happening in like the hormone space. You probably saw the hormone, HRT. We didn't really talk about that, but that was a big moment in the news last week. And, ultimately we're seeing that, more and more hormone clinics are realizing that they need to differentiate themselves as hormone replacement therapy becomes commoditized. And so want to launch a new program like Brain. So if you are interested in that, you can get in touch with FBC. We've got all the details here. If you go to goevomed.com/FBC, the best way to get started is to take the scalability assessment, see where your practice is now, and get a complete insight into what you could do next on that end. Also, big boost marketing. So how do you get your first 30 brain patients in 2026? I've spoken to a lot of practitioners in the last little while who are getting set up to launch a brain health program in 2026, and big boost marketing can bring the people to you. So I want to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a while. And this is a conversation that is happening so often in functional medicine, is that ultimately, how do you know, what do you do with the information? Like when a patient comes in and they say, hey, I'm already taking these supplements, what do you do? And there's two schools of thought. And it actually speaks to the bigger conversation as to, do you make your life as easy as possible? Or do you go above and beyond to support your patients in the best way that you can? And you will face a lot of those decisions, right? When you're running your practice. As an example, lab tests. Is it easier to just order all new labs again? Or could you use the labs that they had ordered through their doctor not that long ago? Different people will make different choices depending on where they are in their practice journey, because the first one is easy. You just have a protocol that comes in and you know how to do it. The other one is a bit harder because you actually have to find their labs. It may not be in the order or the structure that you're looking for. PS, this is part of the reason for True Neuro is organizing the data in the same order every time. We digress. Ultimately though, you have to make these kind of decisions. And one of the decisions that you have to know about is, what do you do when patients bring in the supplements they're already taking? I know that some practitioners will be like, we're starting again. That's obviously not working for you. And some will try and see what you're already working that they like that you should take. And ultimately, this is, again, it's a point of contention because some practitioners are looking to save time, streamline their operations, and just get organized. And that might be helpful at some point. And then some practitioners are really looking to just go above and beyond with their service. And so If there is a way that I can get your labs covered by insurance, I'll try. If there's a way, some information here in the future, if I could get your dietetics covered through your medical nutrition that you probably have inside, medical nutrition therapy codes that we have, that most people have inside their commercial insurance, maybe we should use that too. But specifically with the supplements, I wanted to share that this is actually a cool tool that Fullscript has come up with. And one of the things that we're going to be doing on this show is sharing some of the cool tools that Fullscript has that not many practitioners are using. If you know the history, Fullscript was our first major big sponsor at the Evolution of Medicine. And between 2014, 2019, about 5,000 clinics signed up. Now there's 125,000 practices that use Fullscript. And so it's really unlikely that you haven't heard of Fullscript or you haven't made a decision. But ultimately, their support for our show is really because I believe that there are a lot of tools that are on Fullscript that are really valuable that people aren't just using because they don't know about them. And they've got some really cool tools coming that we'll talk about when it's time to talk about those. But one of the features that I want to share today is in the back end of Fullscript, where you can actually put in the supplements that your patients are already taking. And because all the Fullscript supplements are listed and organized by ingredient, you will be able to see what ingredients maybe you don't need to prescribe because of that information. And that is a big deal. And I really think that patients really appreciate it when their practitioner acts like a confidant. One of the reasons why direct primary care is such a great model is because the practitioner acts as someone who has their best interests at heart, which is hard to find in the medical system. And so they can help them find out, where are the lowest prices for getting an MRI? How do I use my insurance to get these lab results? How do I take best advantage of the resources that I'm already paying for? And I would put this in that category. If you feel like the supplements that people are taking might have value, but they might miss something, what a gift to have you, or ideally someone else on your team, work to be able to support the patient in working out what are they already taking that meets the needs of what you're to prescribe, so that you can reduce the number of new supplements that you need to recommend to people because they have some cases like a whole bag of things that maybe they've been taking or taking recently. If your house looks like my house, there's some area in the house where the supplements are kept, and that area is massive. I've been to a bunch of my friends' houses recently where I'm like, oh, this is your supplement area just like mine, where you see it all lined up and you're like, okay, taking this or taking that. So this is the key value proposition to Fullscript, which is becoming the whole person platform, right? The instigation of how you execute whole person health at scale. And ultimately, this is an example that I've seen inside their software. So we're going to have the links to how that works, and we can actually show you on the site from this video where you can find that capability. And my recommendation is that you try and take best advantage of this, because those practices that go above and beyond to make it easy for their patients to get what they've already paid for tend to have really good long-term retention, really good word of mouth. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable experience for someone to use a tool like this to work out what's already been used. And this could differentiate you from the minds of other practitioners, from the medical doctor or otherwise. So check out the tools. We'll have the link there. If you haven't got a Fullscript account, check out goevomed.com/Fullscript, get one. And over the next couple months, we're going to be sharing with you in these corners some of the tools that are already in there. And there's some really, really exciting things coming from Fullscript when it comes to labs and when it comes to what they're calling journeys. And we'll be getting more into that as we go along. Thank you, Fullscript. Thank you so much for your support. And I hope that if you have a Fullscript account, you'll take some time to go in there and go and look in some of the ingredient recommendation tools, because ultimately that is going to make it easy for you to do the best by your patients. All right, this has been the episode 7 of the Evolution of Medicine podcast. If you think this is relevant to you, please share it. If you were having the same conversations as we were just having here today during the pandemic with your little group of practitioners, share it with them. This is a moment where we can still make up for all of the losses that we shared in the pandemic by educating people about what true immunity is, mucosal immunity, and all of that. I hope that this is as relevant and useful as it was to you as it was to me. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.